The fundamental principles behind occupational health and safety management is the recognition, evaluation, and control of hazards, or as it is often expressed, the identification, assessment, and control of hazards. Virtually every safety initiative has hazard control as its ultimate aim. The formal hazard assessment, which is also referred to as a job hazard assessment, is a safety tool to help people logically examine a particular job or task so that all the hazards associated with that job can be identified and assessed, and when necessary, suitable control measures can be determined. The aim of a formal hazard assessment, or FHA, is simply to document how a particular job should be done safely. The formal hazard assessment is a three-part process and is written out on a form with a layout like this. At the top of the form are basic details which include such things as the job to be analyzed, the date, the location of the job, the people responsible for preparing the FHA, and so on. The main part of the form is broken into 6 columns, each column representing one step in the process. The first and second columns are used to prioritize the step numbers and the basic job steps required to perform the task. The third column is used for listing down any and all existing and potential health and safety hazards that are present. Its relationship to the first 2 columns requires that all hazards for each step are listed in the line with each job step. The next 2 columns are used to evaluate the risk of the identified health and safety hazards utilizing a risk rating system. There are varying approaches to the risk matrix, sometimes utilizing multiple steps with a rating system that includes both letters and numbers. A common approach to the risk matrix includes both the severity, with a 1 being minor and a 3 being major, and the likelihood of the event occurring, with 1 being unlikely and 3 being highly likely. A proper risk rating system must use at least 2 risk rating factors, ranking the highest risk to the lowest risk. The last column is used to record any hazard control measures that must be implemented. The goal is to eliminate hazards altogether. However, if the hazards cannot be eliminated, then control measures must be implemented to minimize the risk. Again, these hazard controls are listed in line with each job step and each identified hazard. Remember, hazard controls include engineer controls, administrative controls, and finally PPE. Hazards can be controlled using one of these control types or a combination of all 3. A formal hazard assessment can be developed in a number of different ways. Generally, the best, and by far the most common way, is by observation. Having 2 or more people actually observing a job being performed is the ideal way. The observation method has the advantage of not relying on memory, and the process also prompts the recognition of hazards. It is also important, and required by legislation, to include or involve workers who actually do the job or have knowledge of the tasks involved in the job process. A variation of this method is to record the job task. Afterwards, the recording can then be watched and dissected by those responsible for developing FHA. Some situations, such as infrequently performed tasks or new jobs, result in the observation method not being practical or possible. In these situations, it is often best to have an experienced group of people complete the analysis through discussion. Let's now look at each of the 3 parts to this process in a little more detail. The first step in performing the FHA is to break the job down into its basic job steps. This step is obviously crucial, as too many job steps make the analysis too complicated, and too few can lead to hazards not being identified. The key to developing this part of the FHA properly is to concentrate your deliberations on what is being done, not to get confused with how it is being done. Once the job steps have been decided, the second stage is to look at each step in turn and identify any and all the hazards that are present for each job step. The success of the FHA pretty much relies on this second stage and the ability to identify all the hazards that are present. Many hazards are relatively easy to identify. For example, are there manual handling requirements, such as lifting, carrying, pushing, pulling? Is excessive force required? Is there adequate illumination? Does this task include the potential of a fall occurring, either from height or from working level? Are hazardous materials involved? Are there unguarded moving parts, and so on? The so-called hidden hazards can be a little more difficult to identify, and depending on the task, it may be necessary to consider such things as the presence of energy sources including electrical, mechanical, thermal, and pressure, whether or not there are hazardous airborne contaminants present, whether there is a potential for a fire or explosion, are there ergonomic hazards, or psychosocial hazards such as fatigue, harassment, or the threat of violence. Again, it is important that the hazards associated with each step are considered in turn. Once this part of the process is complete, the third stage requires that each of the identified hazards is assessed for risk and a proper rating is applied that uses at least 2 risk rating factors, ranking the highest risk to the lowest risk. It must be decided with each hazard whether or not the risk it presents for an incident or injury either needs to be controlled or can be regarded as an acceptable risk. It does not require any specific control measures. Of all the hazards that require control, the best approach is to apply the principles behind what is commonly referred to as a hierarchy of control measures. A hierarchy of control measures categorizes hazard control measures under the following headings: elimination, engineering controls, administrative controls, and the wearing of personal protective equipment. This list prioritizes control measures. It acts as a guide by working down the list when deciding on appropriate control measures. The question that it leads to includes: can we eliminate the hazard altogether? Can we engineer out the problem? Or can we reduce the risk with a physical modification? Can we reduce the hazard by introducing an administrative control? Or do we need to consider the wearing of personal protective equipment? It is also important to remember that many hazards require more than one control measure to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. So that is a brief rundown of the basic process. But how does it work in practice? Let's look at an example that we can all relate to: changing a flat tire. The first step in the process is to observe the task and decide on the appropriate job steps required. Remember, we are concentrating on what is being done, not how it is done. The first step is to park the car and turn off the engine. The next step is to get all the equipment ready. The third step is to remove the hubcap and loosen the wheel nuts. The fourth step is to jack up the car. The fifth step is to remove the wheel nuts and take off the wheel. The sixth step is to put the spare wheel on and replace the wheel nuts. The next step, step 7, is to lower the car, remove the jack, tension the wheel nuts, and replace the hubcap if applicable. And finally, step 8 is to pack away all the equipment. Now we can look at each step and decide what hazards exist. In practice, we can either proceed by listing down all the hazards that apply to each step in turn, or, as we will do in this example, we can identify the hazards for each step and make our decisions on the appropriate control measures at the same time. With step 1, there were 3 hazards. A car may be close to the other traffic. The car may be on soft or uneven ground, or the car may roll. The appropriate control measures are to park the car in a safe area away from other traffic and consider the use of the vehicle's emergency hazard lights. The vehicle should also be parked on a firm, flat surface. You should also apply the parking brake and leave the transmission in gear or park. And finally, place wheel chocks both in front of and behind the wheel diagonally opposite the flat tire. Step 2, we have the potential for general manual handling injuries, and more specifically, the possibility of a back injury when lifting the spare tire. The control measure here is to use correct manual handling techniques, and more specifically, to stand the spare wheel upright and position it as close to the body as possible before lifting it out of the trunk. Step 3 can lead to general injuries and muscle strain. Control measures here include using even force and replacing a single handle wheel wrench with a 4-way wheel wrench, which is easier to use and less likely to slip. Step 4 can lead to the car moving or falling off the jack. The appropriate control measures are to follow the manufacturer's advice on how to properly use the jack and to avoid bumping or leaning on the vehicle. Step 5 presents the possibility of muscle strain or back injury, and the appropriate control measure is to use correct manual handling techniques. Step 6 can again lead to muscle or back injuries. So once again, the control is to utilize appropriate manual handling techniques. Step 7 could lead to hand injuries or strains. Again, use correct manual handling techniques and apply even force when tightening the wheel nuts. And finally, the last step has the potential for manual handling injuries and requires the use of correct manual handling techniques as the logical control measure. In practical terms, the best way to compile information is to develop a separate list, and as a final step, transfer this information to the FHA form. The end result looks something like this. And remember, the object of an FHA is to document how the job should be done safely, and this is not necessarily the way the job is currently performed. There are a number of different benefits that result from the process of conducting FHAs in the workplace. Generally, they focus people's attention on the safety aspects of performing different tasks and therefore result in an effective raising in the overall level of general safety awareness. They are also very useful for 2 other reasons. 1, they can be used as a guide for training purposes. And 2, they are extremely useful as a reference tool when conducting incident investigations. However, the most benefit from conducting FHAs in the workplace is achieved when they are used as the basis for developing written safe work procedures. A FHA can rightly be regarded as the analysis phase for preparing a safe work procedure for many different job tasks. A safe work procedure takes all the must-know information from the FHA and presents it in an easy-to-read narrative-type format. The FHA is one of many tools that can be used in the workplace to improve overall safety. Any process that aims to identify and control hazards will ultimately lead to a safer work environment.